Warning. This episode features discussions of homicide, suicide, domestic violence, and extremism in the form of racist acts. Viewer discretion is advised. What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out. I'm your host, Randon, and I'm super excited to say that I'm finally finished my second year in my clinical psychology doctorate program. I'll be entering my third year, and while I have a little bit of a break, I wanted to come back to podcasting and especially back to YouTube. It's no secret that over the past year, we've had a number of outrageous and sadistic gun violence episodes, and mass shooting has came back into the forefront of mass media and social and political conversations. So I wanted to make my return back to YouTube by doing an episode series that I'm going to call American Issues. These issues are going to range obviously from gun violence for this episode. Future episodes may feature abortion as well as political violence, but without further ado, let's get into this really complicated episode. Sit back, relax, because don't worry, we'll talk it out. I was 2 years old when the surviving students of Columbine High School would graduate. Columbine has become a sort of cultural flashpoint for millions of Americans. It's easy to understand why. It was the first of its kind in the modern era. Two 18-year-olds who had planned meticulously to murder their classmates in Columbine.
Okay, has anybody been injured, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And the school is in a panic, and I'm in the library. I've got students down under the table, kids. Heads under the table.
However, actual clips from that time point towards sadness and shock, certainly, but also optimism that this community would build itself back up, and that these sort of crimes were more random forms of extremist violence. Little did we know.
14 students and one teacher are dead, killed after a shooting at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, just west of.
The worsening toll, at least 59 now dead, more than 500 injured. What they've now discovered in the suspect's Nevada home, his family. You'll hear from them tonight, and the faces of the victims.
With 320
First one began to play out shortly after 10 p.m.
people
local
dancing
time, right
taken
here
just
in
last night, and then at 2:02 a.m., bartenders announcing last call, when suddenly the gunfire.
Gun violence has become an American epidemic. As of 2018, it was estimated there are nearly 400 million civilian-owned guns in America. That would put guns above the number of people and cars in the U.S. By comparison, American gun ownership accounts for 40% of the world's total gun ownership, and this number is only increasing. Since 2018, the firearm industry has grown more than 200%, making it worth $63.5 billion in 2020. But our national conversations around guns are certainly not just about ownership. America has the most mass shootings, gun-related homicides, and firearm suicides out of any similarly developed nation. And past presidents have even commented on this increase in circulation over the last 20 years.
I'm about to leave office. There have been more guns sold since I've been president than just about any time in U.S. history. There are enough guns for every man, woman, and child in this country. And at no point have I ever proposed confiscating guns from responsible gun owners.
Many guns in circulation do not involve serial codes, and Joe Biden has made a big effort to stop these, which are also called ghost guns, made by 3D printed technology. Okay, well, America has a lot of guns. I think most people know that, so what's new about that? Well, the first thing is that the amount of guns are correlated with more homicides, more suicides, and accidental gun deaths. A clear pattern emerged. States that have stronger gun laws see less violence. States like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri have the highest rates per capita of gun violence, but states like New Jersey, New York, or Rhode Island have significantly less. Regardless of what definition is being used, mass shooting accounts for an extraordinarily small percentage compared to the total amount of deaths in America per year. And most of these mass shooting events are gang-related. And as someone who currently lives in New Orleans, I can certainly attest to that. But to avoid people thinking that I'm downplaying mass shootings, I promise you I'm not. I'm trying to put this into a context. We know for a fact that mass shootings have been increasing statistically every single year for the past 10 years. This picture shows a rise in active shooting events. I'm saving my discussions of mass shootings and their psychology for part 3 of this episode, but I can certainly tell you that the most common culprit of these attacks are younger white males, overwhelmed with isolation, rage, and hatred. And due to what's called the copycat phenomenon, these attacks appear to be becoming more and more a byproduct of America's long inclination towards sadistic violence. But again, I'll talk about that in part 3. For now, what else do we actually know about gun statistics? Well, first off, we're still trying to overcome past congressional failures. In 1997, with pressure from the National Rifle Association, Congress would pass what's known as the Dickey Amendment. The Dickey Amendment had a provision in its bill that literally froze funding to the CDC if they mentioned anything regarding gun violence or gun control. Research funded by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg found that from 1996, CDC funding for firearm safety fell 96%, from $5.6 billion to a measly $120,000. A CDC spokesman described that the CDC has not produced any comprehensive study aimed at reducing gun violence since 2001. I say all this to say that we are years behind from getting a clear picture from the research of what we can do to actually prevent gun injury and gun death. I also question the ulterior motives of the government through helping hands of lobbying by the NRA, which leads me to my second part. In 1994, Bill Clinton would sign something called the Federal Assault Weapons Ban.
The war on crime and drugs in America. Topic 2 tonight. First in Washington, as President Clinton signed the crime bill into law. $30 billion for more police, new prisons, harsher penalties for violent criminals, and a ban on 19 assault weapons. During his speech, the president called for a nationwide grassroots effort to fight violent crime.
This video is showing you the certain modifications toward a rifle that was banned. Things like bayonets, underbarrel grenade launchers, a pistol grip, and a folding stock were all outlawed. But again, the companies could easily just remove these modifications and resell the gun, and it would be illegal under the federal assault weapon ban. These loopholes made this ban more of a cosmetic issue than anything that seemed to actually have any real value to reducing injury and gun death. Many researchers will also point out that this ban did really nothing or had minimal effect on decreasing the amount of violence in general. Listen, it's been well documented that the National Rifle Association, or the NRA, has made huge efforts and had a huge impact on the cultural and political influences that the government has over guns. The NRA spends about $5 million a year to influence gun policy, while grading members of Congress on their perceived friendliness to gun rights. You can see in this graph the drastic shift in grading of Democratic members over the last decade, with many more Democrats now receiving F grades from the NRA comparative to 10 to 15 years ago. A great example of the policy and lobbying efforts and how they actually changed the minds of congressional members, we look no further than Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana. In 2017, Scalise was critically wounded at the 2017 congressional baseball game shooting. Scalise would undergo emergency surgery and survive his injuries from that day. The NRA has graded Mr. Scalise as an A-plus advocator of gun rights, and he's been a heavy supporter of the Second Amendment through much of his career. So much so that in response to being shot in a mass shooting, Representative Scalise said that this only further increased his belief in the Second Amendment and gun rights for individual gun owners. Go figure. Part 3. A culture of violence. America is, without a doubt, the most violent, affluent nation in the world. Violence has characterized our nation since its establishment. Founded by colonial occupation and sustained in part by an economy of enslaved people who were eventually emancipated in a civil war with casualties that rivaled world wars. This violence would continue during the Reconstruction era and the dawn of the Wild West era. These scenes provided a standard ingredient in popular entertainment. In the westerns and then in film and on television, the Western man, quick on the draw, was soon an acceptable hero of violence. He found his successors in the private eye, the FBI agent, and in the gangster himself, who so often provides a semi-legitimate object of hero worship, a man with loyalties and courage and a code of his own. All mass cultures have their stereotyped heroes, and none are free of violence, but the United States has shown an unusual penchant for the isolated, wholly individualistic detective or sheriff or villain.
You got me.
I don't want to get too bogged down in ranting about capitalism and how it commodifies even the most egregious forms of violence, but I do believe that a lot of these mass shooters and school shooters are a byproduct of an American capitalist system. Allow me to explain. Part 4. The psychology of mass shooters. Salvador Ramos had just turned 18, Uvalde, Texas. Nicholas Cruz was recently 19, Parkland, Florida. Adam Lanza, 20, Sandy Hook Elementary. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, 18 and 17, Columbine. Young adult males have long stood out for being more impulsive and aggressive than other groups. This connection between violence and masculinity has been studied extensively, so it shouldn't surprise anyone when I say that the overwhelming majority of mass shooters are male, 98% to be exact. Impressionable, naive young men seem to believe that manhood is precarious, and owning a gun is a way to keep that manhood intact. In fact, gun corporations like Remington have targeted impressionable young men using phrases of masculinity and violence to get them to actually buy guns. Recently, Remington was sued by the families of the Sandy Hook victims and settled out of court for $73 million. A majority of mass shooters are young males between the ages of 18 to 21 and middle-aged males under 55. 56% of mass shooters have been white, and over 50% have leaked their own plans weeks in advance of the shooting, mostly through social media posts. Time and time again, mass shooters give off warning signals. They post disturbing images. They show a history of being fascinated with previous shootings and post generalized threats online. A quarter of shooters leave behind a manifesto describing their life and the reasons for committing the murders. Many of these manifestos have featured outright white nationalist beliefs like replacement theory. Most of them are exposed to violence and trauma at a young age of their lives, have a craving for validation, have suffered a recent crisis or trigger, and have the sufficient means to actually plan and carry out the attack. Shooters also participate in an interesting phenomenon that's called the copycat phenomenon. Here's a picture of a trend line from Columbine in 1999 to the modern mass shooter that we think of. On top of all of that, many of these individuals are victims of capitalism in terms of social isolation from others, propensity to believe that violence is a viable plan for retribution, feeling hopeless, depressed, alienated, desperate, fueled by hatred and anger. To bring up someone I bring up pretty often on this podcast, legendary media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who described in the 60s that the lack of authentic identity for men and women would only lead to violence.
That ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. So it's only the threat to people's identity that makes them violence. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed.
And all this is somehow an effect of the electronic age?
Oh, no. But people in all times have been this way. Mm-hmm. But in our time, when things happen very quickly, there's very little time to adjust to new situations at the speed of light.
Okay, I've spent the last 4 parts describing a lot of issues, a lot of different complicated ways in which we frame mass shooting and gun violence, but I'll end it with this. Part 5. Community efforts. I feel the most difficult aspect of a lot of the conversations that we've had around mass shooting and school shootings is the cynicism that I've been seeing over the last year. What can we do? People ask, and they raise their hand and shrug their shoulders. The federal government has already shown that it doesn't seem to be much of a leader in the ways we can look toward them in reducing and preventing gun injury and death. So I honestly feel it comes down to a few things. One is the recognition that gun violence is absolutely a preventable and public health crisis that we have to intervene on. Gun owners and gun trainers have to be trained in a responsible way for various things, right? Suicide intervention methods, mandatory training for licensure. I think Columbine changed the narrative in American history forever. It's not that Columbine invented school shootings or anything like that, but it laid down a narrative focus that changed the way we even view, I think, young children today.
My number one idol is Eric Harris. I think I just see myself in him.
They laid down a cultural script for the next generation of shooters. They had a website. They made home movies starring themselves as hitmen. They wrote lengthy manifestos. They recorded basement tapes. Their motivations were explicitly spelled out. This phenomenon seems resistant to common gun control measures. Things like universal background checks, extended waiting periods, more restrictions for individuals who have a history of juvenile violence or just violence in general, like domestic violence. The issue that I continue to see is that we're actually getting more cynical, right? I share all of this not to discourage people, but I just think we have to have an extraordinarily refocusing of what we're actually talking about here. But it seems that in certain areas, that's not happening whatsoever. I mean, we have multiple Fox News contributors who have openly discussed arming teachers. In fact, Ohio was the first state to just recently allow teachers to open carry if they want to into classrooms. I also think it's a little counterintuitive to always refer to all these individuals as sadistic monsters. The violence that they participate in is absolutely sadistic and awful, and I couldn't even imagine my family going through something as awful as the family in Uvalde or the families in Buffalo are going through. But at the end of the day, these people are still human beings who have a potential to be changed. I want to show a quick clip to end from an Australian mass shooter who was interviewed by the Australian version of 60 Minutes, who openly describes that if he did not have access to a shotgun that his father had in his gun basement, only for a week or two, he wouldn't be in the situation that he's in now, spending the rest of his life in prison, and having to think constantly about the harm that he's inflicted on others.
Decided that I was going to take the shotgun to school.
What do you think would have happened if you couldn't have so easily accessed a gun?
If I didn't have access to a gun, I wouldn't be doing the prison sentence that I am now. If children didn't have such easy access to firearms, then yes, these types of crimes would not happen.
I hope I wasn't rambling at the end there, but in all honesty, guys, I kind of feel like Stephen King here. I'm struggling to come up with a conclusion that's actually sufficient and provides some sort of way forward. I feel like I've touched on red flag laws a bit in the past, and I think those things are very applicable and could really help give some ownership to community members to be able to target individuals that they feel are a danger to themselves or a danger to others, right? But at the end of the day, I don't know if there's a clear solution right now. All it seems to me is that if we continue to pass some proper form of legislation, but also put a lot of the ownership on local and state communities to be able to solve these crises in much quicker form, then maybe we could get there. I don't know, in all honesty. It's sad that I kind of have to end this podcast like this, but I don't know really a way forward as much as I thought I did. Thank you everyone for listening. As always, I'm your host, Randon. If you want to look back at previous episodes, go ahead and do that and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to leave a comment if you like and like the video or dislike it. Hey, if you didn't like anything I had to say, why not? Again, everyone, thank you so much for listening. This has been Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out.